All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead, an interesting daf ahead of us today. Mir Hashem, a beautiful and an interesting daf. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld for dedicating all the shir and drushos this month, L'zecher nishmas, their grandfather, Yosef ben Shmuel Aron. Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya, Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of the shiurim this month in memory of their dear friend and mentor Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our week of learning sponsors, Hilary Jacobson-Kent, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of her daughter, Shifra, Bas Chana Dena. We thank our Day of Learning sponsor today, Bradley Bender, in commemoration of the 6th yahrzeit of his father, Labl Ben Reuven, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Yerachmiel and Judy Nudelman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Richard's father, of Yerachmiel's father, Jack Nudelman, Yaakov ben Moshe Tzvi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the family's a neshama. Well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Ayin Vav. I want to thank Reb Kalman Akiva for giving shir yesterday. I know you got a little bit further down the daf. We're just going to back up just a little bit to the third line down from the top. This way, again, we get the daf in its entirety in. Summer Shmuel. Shmuel says as follows: Nikev v'nistam. So let's remember again, we are on the extremely fascinating topic of Krus Shavcha and Petzua Daka. It's interesting. Krus Shavcha and Petzua Daka. So I'll say, so remember again, one of the things that we've established is that halacha l'maisa in the realm of Krus Shavcha, so ultimately if there's some type of puncture wound that ultimately prevents the zera, prevents the semen from really coming out with force, that by definition, on the most basic level, is a krus shavcha. So listen to this interesting case. Somebody read Shmuel, nikev v'nistam. So let's say there's a puncture, but then it's sealed in, scabs over, sealed in. What's the halacha? Kol she'ilu nikri v'nikra pasal. So I will say, so again, the shaila just is, there's a puncture, the puncture is then sealed, so then does that reverse of the condition of krus shavcha? So the Gemara says it's a very simple calculation. If in a future ejaculation the seal holds, then by definition the person is no longer a krus shavcha. V'lav, so the Gemara says, kol she'ilu nikri v'nikra, if when there's a hotzas zera, ultimately the seal breaks, pasal, v'ilav, kosher, and ultimately again, and if not, and if the seal doesn't break, then the person is kosher. Haviba Rava was bothered by this. Heicha, where exactly is the puncture? If you say that it's below the atara, the corona, afilu nichras, nami, ultimately if it's below the atara, then even if a person is missing part of the aver, it does not render them apostle. Ela ba'atara atzma. Rather, you have to say that it is dealing with the atara itself. Itmar nami, Amar Rav Mari bar Mar, Amar Mar Okvar Shmuel, Nikev ba'atara ve'atzma, if ultimately there was a puncture in the atara itself, v'nistam, and then it's sealed, kol she'ilu nikri v'nikra pasal v'ilav kasher. Again, I'll say, how do you test if ultimately, again, the seal works? On a very simple level, if when there's a hotzas zera, the seal holds, then the person is not a krus shavcha. If the seal doesn't hold, then the person is a krus shavcha. I will say, I'll tell you, one of the things you try to do in the daf is to try to find contemporary relevant meaning in our Gemaras. I'm not going to lie, it's been a shtickle struggle the last couple of days. I'll say, but I'll tell you, I was thinking about this Gemara, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to start a little bit further up. I think that there's an incredible Musar Haskell in this Gemara. Look what the Gemara is describing. The Gemara is describing a person, Nikev, there was a puncture. The puncture was filled in, nistam, and now you have to figure out, ultimately, again, does the seal hold? The only way to test the seal is if there's a hotzas zera. If a person emits zera, a person emits seed. I thought, what an incredible metaphor for tshuva as well. Sometimes in life, nikev. Sometimes in life, you puncture. I have a beautiful neshama, right? I have a beautiful heart. And sometimes, unfortunately, I puncture it. How do you puncture it? You puncture it through averos. You puncture it through negative behaviors. I puncture it through making wrong or bad decisions and going in bad directions in life. That's the nikev. Then there's nistam. Nistam, what does nistam refer to? That's tshuva. That's tshuva. See, both say, so tshuva is the seal, right? Tshuva is the nistam. Both say, how do you know if your tshuva is a real tshuva? How do you know, right? What does the Rambam say? Tshuva. How do you know if your tshuva is a real tshuva? When you're tested again. When you're put in the same exact situation. So that's the Gemara. Nikev, I committed an Aveira, and therefore again there's a hole in my neshama. Nistam, I do tshuva. At the end of the day, kol she'ilu nikri v'nikra. If I'm put back in the same situation and I commit the mistake again, ultimately puzzle, then the tshuva wasn't really a good tshuva, v'ilav. But if I'm put back in the same situation and the seal holds, the tshuva holds, then ultimately, kosher. That's a tshuva. He'll say an incredible Musar Haskel from the words of Chazal. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Shalach le Rava berei de Rabba le Rav Yosef. So Rava, the son of Rabba, sent to Rav Yosef. The Gemara says, Lamdenu Rabbeinu, hechi avdinan. So I will say, this is actually a very important Gemara as well. So the Gemara is asking, in other words, obviously, in the same case, puncture, seal, now the only way to see if the seal is going to hold is for the man to have a seminal emission. So I will say, remember, here it sounds a little bit strange, but here's the crazy part. In other words, whoever the we is, need to see that seminal, it's not me, right? Needs to see, that's totally not in my job description, right? I don't know, call it by Howard. So ultimately, again, so somebody needs to see that seminal emission, right? Someone needs to see that. So ultimately, says the Gemara, how are you bringing that about? So says the Gemara, Amalei, Maisina Nama Chamima Desari Manichan Abe Pokri, Umikri, Vichazina. Okay, so the Gemara is common, like you mentioned in yesterday's daf. So the Gemara introduces this very interesting idea of going ahead and putting warm bread by the anus, and somehow this goes ahead and causes a seminal emission. Okay, so the Gemara says, Abaye. So we'll say, what is the Gemara bothered by? I mean, there's many things one could be bothered by. I will say, but Lamaisa, what the Gemara is bothered by is it's so difficult to bring about a seminal emission. In other words, that like we're dealing with tzaddikim over here, that we're not sure how do you get a man to be motzi zera, like it's such a tough thing. So the Gemara says, Amar le Abaye atakuli amu Yaakov avinu havi tichsiv be kochi v'reishis oni shelo ra'a keri miyamav. The Bible says everybody Yaakov Avinu, whose first seminal emission was in the context of marriage. In other words, I will say to make it sound like, we're not sure how to get a man to go ahead and have a seminal emission. Everybody's Yaakov Avinu, that it's so difficult, not that it's difficult, but everyone's Yaakov Avinu, that there's such a purity of thought that a man can't bring himself to a seminal emission. So Abaye says we will go ahead and literally show him the colored garments of women. So by showing him the colored garments of women, ultimately again that brings him to arousal and it causes him to go ahead and produce a sample. So the Gemara says, one second, Amarava. So I will say, is everyone like Barzilai Hagiladi? So who's Barzilai Hagiladi? Look at Rashi. I will say, this is actually incredible Rashi. Barzilai Hagiladi, Shatov Bezimahaya. Barzilai Hagiladi was a very immoral man. I will say, just saying who Barzilai Hagiladi is. Barzilai Hagiladi was an ally of David HaMelech. When David HaMelech was running away from Avshalom, Barzilai Hagiladi helped him. Now I will say, just the context over here is incredibly important. When David is restored back to power, he invites Barzilai Hagiladi to come and live in Yerushalayim and be supported by the king. So what does Barzilai Hagiladi respond? Look at Rashi. Shatov pezimahaya d'chsiv bei im yitam avdecha. So Barzilai Hagiladi gives a very interesting response. He says to David, I'm already an old man. Food doesn't have the same flavor. He was saying like, I'm old. And so the truth is, it's very nice that you're inviting me to come and live in Yerushalayim and dwell at your table. But at the end of the day, I'm an old man. I don't really enjoy the physical pleasures of life all that much. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Barzilai Hagiladi was not an old man, yet he feels like an old man. How do you understand his advanced old age? So the Gemara says, Rashi says, Shatov bezimahaya lefichach kaftsa alav zikna. He was very immoral. So I will say because of his immorality, ultimately, again, he aged prematurely, which I will say, if you think about it, is also an incredibly profound yesod. If a person misuses their life kochos in the wrong way, right? There's a certain koach we have in life. There's a reservoir of energy. If I use my energies in the wrong direction, I use them in the wrong way, ultimately it saps me of my vitality. This is often we think that the downside of chait is the onesh, is the punishment. Onesh is one part of chait. But you know what's even worse? The real tragedy of sin is the fact that I'm taking energy that could have been used towards doing something good, and I've misused it and misappropriated it for something negative. That's the real tragedy. Because onesh, we'll say, you know what the great part about onesh is? The great part about punishment is? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a rachamon, and if you do tshuva, it's easy enough to sidestep the onesh. The real tragedy of chait is energy that could have been used for dynamic, productive activity has now been squandered in the pursuit of nothing. So Barzilai Hagiladi is not old, but he feels old because he spent a life of immorality. And as a result, he's squandered all of his kochos. So I will say, what an incredible yesod. It's something for us to think about because we're all tempted by Avera, probably, right? Many of us all day, all the time. And sometimes it's just a question of, if I use this bucket of strength for this particular negative endeavor, that's less strength, that I have for my family, for myself, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for mitzvahs, for chesed, for Torah. And hopefully that knowledge that I'm literally actively squandering resources hopefully gets me to think twice and gets me to make the right decisions in life. The Gemara goes weiter. Let's say two incredible Musar skills just from the top of I involved. Tanrabanan, Nikev, Basel, Mipnei Shushie. So we'll say back to the Khrushchevka. Right? So ultimately, if there's a puncture, so ultimately it's possible because of Khrushchevka. Why? Because we assume that the zera will drip. We'll say,
Can I ask something,
please.
Nikev v'nistam. Only if it nistam by itself.
Oh, we're going to see that.
If a surgeon is going and fixing it.
We're going to see even artificially. Doesn't have to be a natural seal. We're going to see that in just a moment. Don't get any ideas. Only Jews from Eretz Yisrael could ask questions. I just want to point out. That's a special skill if you live in Eretz Yisrael. Right? So let's say, the Gemara says as follows. Ultimately, again, I will say, if there's a puncture, and then so he's puzzle, right? because it drips as opposed to flows. Nistam, if it's sealed, kosher, mipnei shuhu molid. Because Rabbi say, again, if there's a seal, then we assume the presence of the seal allows the zera to exit the body with force. V'zeu psul shechozer la'achshiro. And I will say, so you see, very interesting that a person could be a Khrushchevka, right, could be puzzle, but then again, ultimately, if the puncture is sealed, they could be returned to their original status of personalistic kashrus. So Gemara says, it sounds like this is a case where you could reverse the psul. But when it says this usually does what? Comes to exclude something else. So lemeute mai, lemeute karum sha'ala machmas maka bereya, de'eno karum. Rabbi said, this is actually very interesting. This comes to exclude the following case. What happens, I'll say, we know that one of the trephas in an animal is if the lung is punctured. What happens if the lung is punctured, but then the puncture scabs over? I will say we do not say that the animal is returned to its kashrus. Once the animal has a puncture in the lung, ultimately, again, it is a treifa, and even if it scabs over, it's not kosher. I will say that's why, interestingly enough, when we go ahead and shecht an animal, one of the things we check for in glat kosher kashrus are we check to see that the lungs are smooth. If there's something called the sircha, which essentially is a scab in the lungs, what that tells us is the animal had a puncture, the puncture scabbed over, and ultimately, again, the animal is treif. We'll say it's actually very interesting. You know how they check? For sirchas in lungs? They inflate the lungs. It's fascinating. They inflate the lungs, and when they inflate, it's fascinating. You could see very clearly if there was a scab. So I will say, so the Gemara is just pointing out over here, it's very interesting. So by Khrushchevka, ultimately again, if there's a puncture and it heals, the individual is once again kosher. By an animal, if there's a puncture in the lungs and it heals, the animal is not kosher. So the Gemara goes right there. So listen to this. This goes to the shayla that was just asked. So I will say, now let's say someone has a puncture wound, a puncture in the aver, and we want to help this person. We want to seal it up. How do you seal it up? In other words, we're asking through intervention, right? Surgical means we like to do surgery to go ahead and say, how do you do it? So I'll say, this is absolutely fascinating. So the Gemara says, here's what we do. Maisinan sarta, we go ahead and we bring a barley kernel, or misartinon, or it can also be a wheat kernel, misartinon lay, we scratch the surface, we scratch the area, ultimately, again, where the puncture wound is, in order to make it bleed. Rashi says over something very interesting. Rashi says, misartinon lay kol siyos hanakev kidei shiaglia theotzi damito kach huma'ala aruka ubasar. As we'll say, what we want is we want to irritate the area a little bit. Because by irritating the area a little bit, it's a shtickle swollen. You're going to see that's, watch what we're going to do. So we'll say, now watch this. Umaysinan tarba, we take fat, vishaifinon, and we go ahead and we smear it on the affected area. Now we'll say, now watch this. Umaysinan shumshima gamla, we take a large ant, Rashi says, namala gidola, uminaschinon lei. Rashi says, manichin rosha sham v'noshech v'nidbak rosha. We bring the ant, we have the ant bite the affected area. Shabbos say, now watch what's happening over here. Shabbos say, so now you have the fat that's smeared on the area, the ant bites. Now the ant inserts its head in the opening, right in the nekev, in the, what did I say it was? The nekev? The hole. But what was the word I used before? I didn't use hole. Puncture, thank you. In the punctured area, right, in the hole. Right, and then Rabbi say, what happens? Upaskina le'lereshe, and then we cut the head off the ant. So essentially, Rabbi is fascinating. So Rabbi say, so the ant head, together with the fat, essentially plugs the hole, plugs the puncture. Rabbi say, I just pointed out something amazing. This is Talmudic surgery. Rabbi say, just understand. And by the way, I just want to point out, this wasn't the Jewish thing, right? And Rabbi say, this was the medicine of their days. Rabbi say it's a variety of things. It's the same thing. And yet, Rabbi say, in general, whenever you see Talmudic medicine, just like in yesterday's daf, we had the situation of the Gemara highlighting the idea that semen and urine come out from two different tubes. Rabbi say, b'pashtos, it's not nishtanu hateva. It's not that we physiologically change, because that would be such a dramatic physiological change that the idea. It's how they understood the body. It's how they understood medicine. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he's quoted as saying, in the nishmas Avram. Nishmas Avram. Dr. Avram Steinberg was a chief of medicine at Hadassah Hospital. So he wrote like an encyclopedia on Shulchan Aruch with medical issues. See, quotes of Shlomo Zalman in the beginning of that, in Chelek Aleph, Rav Shlomo Zalman says, whenever you see Chazal speaking about medicine, that's not halacha, that's reflecting the medical knowledge of their time. Which is why Rav Shlomo Zalman says, follow Gemara to the T, but never in anything medical. Never anything medical. We do not take the refuahs of Chazal, we do not take the medicine of Chazal, because again, I will say, that wasn't something to anchored in Yiddishkeit, that was the medicine of the time. So I was just pointing out, how incredible is it? What you're seeing is Talmudic age surgery. This was the surgery. Scratch the affected area, cause it to swell, cause it to bleed, take fat, which I will say is a great way to plug anything. But now you need something. I will say, what's the role of the ant? You need suturing. You need something to suture the spot. So the ant bites, closes the affected area, lop off the head. We're good to go. By the way, you could do this in your living room. I just want to point out, no copay either. I will say, in other words, I don't know for the doctors. I don't know like what you put on the insurance form for this one, right? I don't know. I will say, but again, I just want to point out, it's it's incredible. So sometimes we look at these things and we're like, oh my gosh, what is this? I will say, it's Talmudic surgery. And by the way, if you kind of like, when you get over a little bit of like the ant head and fat and all this kind of stuff, it's actually pretty incredible. It's actually pretty incredible, given the times in which it's actually absolutely incredible what they were able to pull off. Incredible. So let's go back to Moshe. So the Gemara says, Aval parzala Mizrav Zar. We'll say, but again, it's very interesting. The Gemara says, Dafka use a wheat kernel, don't use steel. Don't use steel. Why? Because Rabbi say steel, right? A little piece of steel, because you can use a piece of steel to go and irritate the area. That could actually make things worse. Rashi points out over here, Mizrav Zarif Osif Chabura. Osif Chabura. Rabbi say this could actually make the wound even worse. Okay? Vahani mili katan. Avagodol mikipli mikbal. And I will say this is only ultimately if it's a small puncture, but if it's a larger puncture, ultimately, and the problem is if the seal won't hold. Both say if a person urinates from two places, which I will say means essentially when they urinate, the stream comes out of two parts of the aver. They have a puncture wound. And therefore, as a result, urine comes out of two parts. So the Gemara says, puzzle, such an individual is puzzle. Amar Rava, less, so it says incredible. Rava says, less hilchasa, lo kibra v'lo ka'aba. So Rava says, the halacha doesn't follow the son, nor does it follow the father. Because you must remember again, this was a statement from Rabba Bar Rav Huna. So the Gemara said, so Rava comes along, he says the halacha doesn't follow Rav Huna, and Rabba, and it doesn't follow the son, Rabba, and it doesn't follow Rav Huna. So the Gemara says, so kibra hada amran. So it's this incredible Gemara. So it doesn't follow the son like we just said, that just because you urinate from two places, that does not make you a krus shafcha. And Abba, what's the statement of the fallacy of Rav Huna? Abba say interesting. He's Rav Huna, Nashim hamsololos zubazu. So Abba say Rashi says over here, women misololos. Rashi says misololos derech tashmish zacha unekeva mishav shifos nekevasan zuz. Abba say misolos literally means rub against each other. This is referring to women who engage in homosexual activity. So women who are gay and engage in sexual behavior with each other. Rav Huna says, psulos lekahuna. Ultimately, again, they are pasul lekahuna. They're pasul lekahuna. Vafilu l'Rabbi Elazar, the Amar Sarfilu Rabbi Elazar, who says, Panei habala pnuya shaloshem ishos asazona. Even going to Rabbi Elazar, who holds that Allah lamaisa, a man and woman who have relations, not for the sake of marriage, ultimately that woman becomes a zona and therefore is precluded from marrying a kohen. Hani mili ish. That's when there's between a man and a woman. Aval isha pritzusa ba'alma. But two women engaging in sexual behavior with each other, Abosai, does not render either of them a zona. Abosai, for one simple reason. In halacha, bia is defined as penetration. It could be bia kidarka, bia shelo kidarka, but there has to be a penetration. So it's very interesting. From the eyes of halacha, when two women engage in sexual behavior, it's pritzus. It's considered to be something immoral, but interestingly enough, it does not have the designation ultimately of illicit sexual behavior, which means that halacha lamaisa, they would not be categorized as a zona, and therefore neither of them would be precluded from marrying a kohen. Very interesting halacha. So we'll say, by the way, that's actually how he paskin halacha lamaisa. This is the major distinction between two men engaging in sexual behavior versus two women engaging. Often we group everything under gay behavior, but lamaisa, it's important to understand they're actually different. They're actually different halachically. We'll say before we go on, I'll just mention something very interesting. One of the things I forgot to mention over here, when we were speaking about the guy of Nikev Vinistam, ultimately again there's a puncture and then it's healed, and we want to see, does the seal heal? So the Gemara was trying to speak about, again, how do we get him to produce a sample in order that we could see that ultimately that the seal held. I will say it is interesting to note, why isn't that a problem of hashchasas zera levatala? Right? In other words, we want the guy to produce zera. We want him to ejaculate, but again, it's not in the context of relations. We just want. So we'll say, so what's the pshat? So we'll say, you see over here something incredibly amazing, which is the definition of hashchasas zera levatala means when there is no purpose for the ejaculation. But halacha lemaisa here, there is a purpose. What's the purpose? We want to check him. We want to see the seal. Now, Abba say, I want to tell you, why is this incredibly important? Because Abba say, this comes into the realm of artificial insemination, just in general, reproductive science. Because very often when a couple is struggling with fertility, the first thing you have to find out is Where is the challenge, right? Is the challenge in the sperm count of the man? Is the challenge in the challenge with the woman? So I will say it used to be, it's very interesting. So it used to be in reproductive medicine, the way they would check semen samples was very simple. Couple would have relations, and then ultimately, again, they would essentially do vaginal retrieval. They'd go into the woman afterwards, and they would go ahead and retrieve the zera like that. Later on, as the science progressed, they understood that to really understand what was going on, they needed what they call the clean sample. The clean sample. So there's a lot of this, which means halacha l'maisa, they want the man to be motzi zera, not inside of his wife, outside. So I will say, so this raises an entire discussion about how to get a sample. So halacha l'maisa, just pointing out that many poskim say that a man is permitted to produce a sample because halacha l'maisa, that's not called hotza'as zera levatala. It's not levatala. This is for a very important purpose to see what is next. And I will say, now I'll just tell you, but what does come up is, how does the man produce the sample? I will say, by the way, it's very interesting. In other words, that we're going through this whole thing with the barley and the right? So I will say, so why don't we just tell the man, just stimulate yourself and just go and produce a sample? I will say, because you see from here that halacha l'maisa, even when it's permitted to be motzi zera, it is not permitted to be motzi zera biyad. That ultimately, again, to cause oneself to go ahead and produce a sample, that the halacha does not ideally, unless there are like dire circumstances, does not want. So therefore, it would be better for the couple to have relations and for the man to be motzi zera than outside of his wife. But that's why, again, the Gemara doesn't entertain the possibility of the man being motzi zera himself. There's got to be some external stimulant in order to be able to get him to be I know we're getting a little bit off topic over here. I'll say it again. Let's get back to the Mishnah. Anyway, I'll say my point over here, I'm just pointing out how sometimes you see Gemaras and you think that like, oh, interesting. And I will say you don't understand like the impact that this Gemara has on couples struggling with fertility, and the idea that this Gemara opens up possibilities. I will say, from Smichas Chaver, many poskim still are against the man being motzi zera outright for just a sample. Satmarav was one of them. Other poskim, but I'm just pointing out the whole license to engage in fertility treatments and fertility studies is based on this Gemara. Incredible. Mishnah. It will say, P'tzua daka, krushav, chamutar, megiores, mushichrares, ve'enon asun ela milava bakal. Well, since this, now let's get into, now that we defined our terms, let's discuss a little bit. P'tzua daka. Azriel, I see Morty. Is that Morty Miller, your son, on Zoom? Okay, you're going to have a long talk with him when you get home today. I'm sorry, I see Morty on here, like, oh gosh, all right. I just clear your afternoon. All right, so the Gemara says, all right. Tell him, stay in school. That's right, so the Gemara says, so says into this. Weiter. So Petzua Daka Krushavcha are permitted with the Giores and Mishra. So we'll say, so here's what we know. Petzua Daka and Krushavcha are not permitted to come bakal. Right? They're not permitted to marry into the general assembly of Klal Yisrael. So who are they permitted to marry? So the Gemara says they're permitted to marry a Giores and a Mishuchreres. Right? A Giores, a convert, a Mishuchreres, an emancipated slave. Ve'enon asur ela milava bakal. They're only prohibited to marry into what we'll call the general marriage pool. Shnei Amar, lo yavo Petzua Daka krushavcha b'kal Hashem. Ultimately, again, the pasuk says the Petzua Daka krushavcha can't come into Kal Hashem. Good. Says the Gemara, we'll say fascinating shayla. Ba'u minei Rav Sheshas Petzua Daka kohen mahu b'giores mishuchrares. So we'll say, listen to this shayla. What happens if you have a kohen who's a Petzua Daka? Is a Kohen Petzua Daka permitted to go ahead and marry a Giores and a Mishuchraras? So we'll say here the Shaila, a Kohen is not permitted normally to marry a Giores or a Mishuchraras. But what about if he's a Petzua Daka? We'll say, what's the Shaila? Bikdusha se kai va'aser, of dimala bikdusha se kai v'shari. We'll say, what's the fundamental Shaila? The fundamental Shaila is does a Kohen Petzua Daka retain his Kedushas Kahuna or not. If he retains his Kedushas Kuna, then he may not marry a Giyoros Mishuchreres. If he does not retain his Kedushas Kuna, he may marry a Giyoros Mishuchreres. So which one is it? So the Gemara says, Amrli Rav Sheish says, Tinisua, we learn this, Petzua Daki Yisrael, Mutter ben Nesina. A Petzua Daki Yisrael is permitted to marry a Nesina. Now I will say, the Nesinim, remember again, the Nesinim were the group of people who disguised themselves, when Yoshua comes into Eretz Yisrael, they disguised themselves as a non-indigenous nation. In order to escape the fate of the Zayin Ummus, of the 7 nations, they disguised themselves as a foreign nation. So Yoshua made a treaty with them. Then ultimately, again, they were discovered to have lied about their identity. Yoshua didn't want to break the treaty, so they were relegated to the status of water carriers. So the Gemara says, a Petzuadak Yisrael is permitted to marry a Nesina. Now, both say this is very interesting. The Gemara is assuming over here that halacha lamaisa. Well, actually, let's see. So the Gemara says, you see that Petzuadaka, who is Yisrael is permitted to marry a Nasin or Nesina. Ultimately, yet the Torah says you're not supposed to marry them. So what does that show you? That a Petzuadaka loses his personalistic Kiddusha. So too I would say that a Kohen Petzuadaka is also permitted to marry one of these women. Amarava, Atu asa mishim Kiddusha v'lav Kiddushu, Dilma molid ben ba'azo palach la'avodas kochavim. The Gemara says, a Nesina is a non-Jew. The reason why Yisrael is not permitted to go out and marry a non-Jew is out of a fear that if you have children with her, her children ultimately again will be Ovid Avodah Zarah. So the Isser to marry a Nesina or a Nasin is when they're a guy. Ki megairi b'Yisrael sharu. When they convert, ultimately again they can marry Yisrael. For Rabbanon hu de gazrubahu. The rabbis were the ones who stepped in and said you shouldn't marry a Nesin convert. The Gemara says, and Chazal only goes there in a situation where they're capable of having children, where the man is capable of having children. But I will say this individual is not capable of having children, i.e. the Krush Shavcha, right, to the Petzuadaka. Chazal will not go there on him. So he could marry a Nesina convert. Well, if that's the case, then a mamzer, ultimately, who is capable of having children, should not be permitted to go ahead and marry a Nesina. Vatnan, we learn, Mamzerim unesinim mutarim lavo zebozeh. Mamzer and Nesina are permitted to marry each other. To which the Gemara says, Eliki gazer abanim b'ksherim b'psulim lo gazer. So I will say, what the Gemara seems to say is like this. A Nasin who is not Jewish, there's a general, you can't marry a non-Jew. There is no marriage by a non-Jew. When a Nasin converts, Chazal said, you shouldn't marry them. But who shouldn't marry them? Only people capable of having children. But people incapable of having children, or for that matter, again, people who are genealogically unfit, like Mamzerim, are permitted to marry Nesin converts. So the Gemara says, Hada Amarava, Lav Milsihi. Rava says the truth is this whole discussion is not true. What I said before is not true. When the Nesin is not Jewish, there's no marriage in general with a non-Jew. So the Gemara says this: Gairu islei chasnus. When they convert, they're just like any other convert, and therefore halacha l'maisa you're permitted to marry them. Masiv Rav Yosef vayischatin shlomas bas paro melech Mitzrayim. So I will say, what do you, now? Both the Gemara is going back and just said before, there's no such thing as marriage with a non-Jew. Really? The pasuk says that Shlomo HaMelech married Bas Paro. Bas Paro Bepashtos wasn't Jewish, but yet he married her. To which the Gemara says, no, gayure gaire. He converted her. Then he married her. So the Gemara says, but one second. V'halo kiblu gerim lo b'mei David v'lo b'mei Shlomo. I will say the Gemara says that we did not accept converts during the days of Shlomo, or David or Shlomo. I will say this goes back. We had the sugya of gerus in Yevamos. We had this sugya. And I will say, remember again, we only accept gerim when it's times of challenge for Klal Yisrael. Because again, if everything is going great, everybody wants to be on the winning team. So I said, the Gemara says, historically, we did not accept converts during the days of David and Shlomo because that was like a golden age of the Jewish people. Similarly, when else won't we accept converts? In the Messianic era, Moshe Mashiach. So again, how was Shlomo able to convert to Bas Paro? To which the Gemara says, 1 second. Midi hu time el shulchan malachim. They both say the reason we don't go ahead and convert people during the days of David and Shlomo is because there's a concern that they're going to want to enjoy the wealth and prosperity of the Jewish people. That's why they're converting. Amud Beis. Lo tzricha lo. They both say Bas Paro was already royalty. So because she was already royalty, there was no concern that she was converting in order to eat at Shulchan Malachim. Why not? Why not? I will say, she already lived on Shulchan Malachim. But still, even if he did convert her, how could he marry her? V'seifuk the hamitzis rishonahi. I will say, 1 second. Even if Shlomo, supposed to say second line of Ayin Vav days, even if Shlomo did convert Bas Paro, he still can't marry her. At the end of the day, ultimately, she's a mitzvahs rishona. She's a first generation Mitzri convert. And I must remember again, Mitzri can convert, but they're limited in their marriage pool until when? Third generation. So the Gemara says, maybe you'll say that by the time of Shlomo HaMelech, the Mitzrim of the days of Shlomo HaMelech were not the real Mitzrim. They weren't the real Mitzrim. Ultimately, again, because maybe the nations got mixed up and the Mitzri Shlomo was not a real Mitzri. So Gemara says, no. Rabbi Yehuda says, listen to this. Minyamin, my friend, was a Ger Mitzri Haya. Right? So I will say, this is Rabbi Yehuda saying, Minyamin, my friend, was an Egyptian convert. So my friend Minyamin, who was one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, was a first generation Egyptian convert. And Minyamin used to say, Amar, Ani Mitzri Rishon v'nasasi Mitzri Rishona. I'm a first generation Egyptian convert, and I married another woman who's also first generation. Asi lebni Mitzri Shnia. My son will be a second generation convert. I'll marry him off to a second generation Mitzri convert as well. Kadei shehei ben b'ni ra'oi lavo bakal. In order that my grandson will be permitted to marry to the general pool. Now, obviously, Minyamin, the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, is living way after the times of Shlomo HaMelech. So if again, in the times of Rabbi Akiva, we're still concerned about Egyptian converts, still in the times of Shlomo HaMelech, we're concerned as well. So even if you want to say that Shlomo was able to convert her, at most she's what? A first generation Egyptian convert. And a first generation Egyptian convert is not permitted to marry into the regular pool. To which the Gemara says, Amra Papa, Anan mishlomo leiko v'nasiv, Shlomo lo nasiv. I will say, so Papa says, what are you getting all worked up about? Shlomo didn't marry her. He just lived with her. Right? There wasn't really a marriage. In other words, he married, so to speak, they were husband and wife, but there was no halachic marriage there. 1 second. Midi dechsiv bei, menegayim she'amar Hashem b'nei Yisrael lo savol b'hem, ve'im lo yaval b'chem, achin yitu es levavam acharei Eloheihem. So again, because the pasuk says explicitly, from the nations that Hashem told us not to marry into them, Shlomo HaMelech was connected, right? Shlomo's heart clung to one of these women. So the Gemara says, Alakasha vayischatein, but the pasuk says he married Bas Paro. Mitoch ava yisir sha'ava ma'ala alav akasav ki'ilo nischatein ba. I will say this is fascinating. The Gemara says, she didn't convert. Because also even if she didn't convert, it didn't matter. He still couldn't marry her. So halacha l'maisa will say, it says that he married her. He didn't marry her, but rather again he loved her so much that it was kilu they were married. In other words, they conducted themselves as a married couple, even though again halachically there was absolutely no marriage there. Incredible. I will say. I just want to point out. I will say this was a tremendous avera. Just like Gemara is talking about this, like kind of like matter of fact. But remember again, this part of this led in a dramatic way to Shlomo HaMelech's downfall. Remember again, we saw the Gemara Maseches Gittin, a whole story with Ashmedai. Shlomo HaMelech writes Koheles. Shlomo HaMelech suffers an incredible descent. Right? Whether the story with Ashmedai is literal or it's metaphorical, it represents a profound spiritual fall for Shlomo HaMelech. When did that fall occur? It was in the aftermath of this marriage. Because Bas Paro brought all of her avodah zara with her, and it's not just her. He had other wives like this, and Shlomo HaMelech suffered a stunning spiritual defeat. The incredible story of Shlomo HaMelech is he got back up. he got back up and he reclaimed his throne and he reclaimed his spiritual glory and he reclaimed his spiritual standing. But again, Rabbi said this was a huge avera that led to a tremendous descent on the part of Shlomo HaMelech. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ravashi, Va'anan Tanan, Petzua Daka Kroshavcha, Mutar Begaras Mishacharas, Hab and Sinas. Rabbi says, so back to the Nisan. So we learn that in the Mishnah that a Petzua Daka and a Kroshavcha are permitted in a Giores and a Mishacharas. But it sounds like they're not permitted to marry Nesina. Amrali l'tamech ema seifa ve'enon asurin ela milava bakal ha benesina sharu. Rabbi said, if you look at the end of the Mishnah, what does the end of the Mishnah say? They're not permitted to marry to the normal marriage pool, which sounds like that they are permitted to go out and marry Nesina. Ela mehalak ela mashmina. Another Rabbi say you can't bring a raya from here. So we'll say, let's go back for a moment. Let's just talk about the halacha lemaisa. So how do we paskin? Because Rabbi say the truth is this is actually quite fascinating. Let's talk about the Kohen case. How did this all get started? We wanted to know, can a Kohen Petzua Daka marry a Giores or a Shifra Mishuchreres? Right? Because the point of the Mishnah was that a Petzua Daka is not permitted lavo bekal Hashem. He is not permitted to marry into the normal marriage pool. Who is he permitted to marry? A convert or an emancipated slave? Okay. The Gemara asked, what about a Kohen? Is a Kohen also permitted to marry a Giores or a Mishuchreres? Which is another way of asking, does a Kohen Petzua Daka retain his Kohanic holiness or does he lose it? So let's listen to this. The Rambam in Hilchos Isurei Bia, Perek Tes Zayin Halacha Aleph, writes as follows, says, Petzua Daka are not permitted to go ahead and marry into the normal marriage pool. They're not permitted to marry a Bas Yisrael. However, umutaran lisa gyoretz mishuchreres. So Rambam Paskin is like our Mishnah. A regular Petzua Daka is permitted to marry gyoretz mishuchreres. Here we go. Va'afilu kohen shu Petzua Daka mutar lisa gyoretz mishuchreres lefi she'eno b'kedusha. So incredible, Rabbi say. A Kohen Petzua Daka does not have his Kedushas Kuhuna. And because he doesn't have his Kedushas Kuhuna, he is permitted to marry a Giores and a Mishchar. So Shabbos is really incredible. Now, the fascinating part will be the status of his offspring, right? Because Shabbos say, so, but we'll talk about that later. Shabbos say, but the idea is incredible. So you can have a case of a Kohen, good. Somebody asks you, what's the case of a Kohen who can marry a Giores? And the answer is, Petzua Daka. The Rambam also says over here, Krushavcha, right? So too, whether it's a regular Petzua Daka or a Kohen Petzua Daka, could also marry an Esina who converts or any of the other nations who convert. Incredible. So that's the halacha. Good. Mishnah. Amoni Ma'avi. So now that we started speaking about the people, by the way, I just want to tell you, great week of Gemara ahead of us. Really fascinating sugyas. Now that we started talking about the Petzua Daka and Kroshavcha, that they are not permitted to marry into the regular pool, the Gemara says, Amoni Umo Avi, Asurin v'Isurin Isra Olam. Both say an Amoni and a Moavi, someone from the nation of Ammon and Moab. They both say, by the way, Ammon and Moab they are cousins, right? These are the descendants of Lot. We are the descendants of Avraham. These are our cousins. So the Gemara says, so an Ammoni and Moavi. So people who convert from Ammon and Moab, Asurim are prohibited. The Isuram Isur Olam. Now we'll say, when we say prohibited to what? Prohibited to marry into the normal marriage pool. We'll say they could convert, right? In other words, a person from Ammon is permitted to convert, but they are always going to be limited in terms of who they can marry. As opposed to, let's say, the Egyptian, who when he converts is limited for 3 generations, but after 3 generations totally blends in. Ammon and Moab can convert, but will always be restricted with their marital pool. Aval nikivoseihem mutaris miyad. But Abba said this prohibition only applies to men from Ammon and Moab. Women from Ammon and Moab, if they convert, are permitted to immediately integrate. Mitzri ve'adomi, a Mitzri and an Adamite, they have a 3-generation limit where they are limited to marrying only other Mitzri or Edomite converts or other converts. But ultimately, again, after 3 generations, they are permitted for a full integration. Echad zchar ve'echad nekevas, both men and women. Rabbi Shimon matir es hanekevas miyad. Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa, Mitzri and Edom just like the women are permitted to marry into the general pool immediately. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, Kal v'chomer advarim. Rabbi Shimon says, it's Kal v'chomer. Uma in Bamak. First, why line about Sayin Vavim days? Uma in Bamakom Shasras Hazakarim Isra Olam Hitir Asanakevos Miad. In a case of converts who are prohibited forever. I'll say, what's the case of converts who are prohibited forever? What's that case? Ammon and Moab. So in Ammon and Moab, where the men are prohibited forever from marrying into the regular marriage pool, the women are permitted immediately, right? So therefore, again, so the Gemara says, Makom shelo asras hascharim elat shlosha doros eino din shenater sanakevos miyad. Rabbi Shimon says, so then certainly in a case where the men themselves are only restricted for 3 generations, which is what case Rabbi say, Mitzri and Edomi, the women should be permitted to marry into the general pool immediately. Amrulo, so I said to Rabbi Shimon, im halacha nekabel ve'im ladin yesh tshuva. So Rabbi Shimon, let me ask you, is this a halacha, or is it, in other words, what's going to say this halacha is this something you received from your Rebbe, or is just your own idea? If it's your Masorah, if it's a Masorah, then we'll accept it. But if it's your own idea, then we will refute it. What the refutation is in Meretz Hashem, we'll see in the Gemara. Through Rabbi Shimon says, "Lo ki alocha ani omer." Rabbi Shimon says, "No, I'm not making stuff up, or it's not my own idea, but rather again, this is the tradition I have received from my Rebbeim." Beautiful. So we'll say let's analyze. Minahanimili. Let's say where is this from? So we'll say, remember again. Let's go back for just a moment. The first halacha in the Gemara was about the convert from the nations of Ammon and Moab. And what's their status from Ammon and Moab? The halacha is they could convert, but halacha l'maisa, the men are forever restricted from marrying into the regular marriage pool. Forever restricted. The women are not. So the Gemara says, from where do we know this? Minahanimili. Rabbi Yochanan, Tamer Kra'o, Kiros, Shaul says, incredible Gemara. Kiros Shaul as David Yotze Likras HaPlishti. Let's listen to this. When Shaul saw David going out to do war with Goliath. Right? So, David, remember again, this famous story. Goliath is taunting the Jewish army. We'll say, so what happens? Remember again, so Shaul, and everybody's paralyzed with fear. Everyone's paralyzed with fear. Shaul put out a reward. Whoever is willing to go ahead and go out and face Goliath and is successful, so Shaul promises him wealth and promises him what else? His daughter Michal's hand in marriage, and young David, unseasoned warrior, right? Unseasoned soldier, just a shepherd, rise his chance. Also, remember again, where does this take place? In Emek Ha'ela. Right, you can go right outside of Beit Shemesh. Right, you can go Emek Ha'ela. You could see the spot of the war of David and Goliath. So Kiros Shaul as David Yotze Likras HaPlishti. So Shaul sees David go out to go ahead and do war with Goliath. Amar el Avner Sarat Sava ben Mihanar Hazeh. Right, bin Abinar Hazeh Avner. Ve'omer Avner Chayna Shchamelech im Yadati. So the Gemara says. So Shaul says to Avner, his general, Avner, who is this boy? Mizanar, who is this? And Avner says, I don't know. So the Gemara says, Velo Yadale? What are you talking about? Neither Shaul nor Avner knew who David was. Of course they did. V'haksiv vayaveu ma'od v'ahilo l'nosei kelim. Ultimately, again, the pasuk says that Shaul loved David very much, right? And David was like a shield bearer. He used to carry around, he was like his weapons caddy, right? He was going ahead and carrying around his weapons. So what do you mean that Shaul didn't know who David was? Ella, listen to this. Avua kamashil. So no. Shaul was not asking Avner about David. He was asking Avner about David's father. Va'aviv lo yadale. So Shaul and Avner didn't know David's father Yishai. Va'aksiv va'ish bimei Shaul zakin ba ba'anoshim. Va'amar Rav Yitim Rabbi Abba ze Yishai avi David shenichnas ba'ochlasa v'yatza ba'ochlasa. Both say Yishai was a very well-known man, both a scholar and a warrior who went out with the multitudes. In other words, he was always surrounded by people. Everyone knew Yishai and everyone knew David. So what's the pshat? So we'll say, remember, see the problem? So ultimately, David is going out to do battle with Shaul. And in that moment that David goes out, Shaul asks Avner, who is the lashon of the pasuk is, right? Mi ze hanar. Who is this? So the Gemara says, what's the question? It can't be he's asking who's David because he knows David. Can't be he's asking who his father is, who's Yishai. They know Yishai. So what is he asking? Rabbi say, get ready for this. Hachi kamar Shaul. Imi peretz asi, imi zerach asi. Wow. Shaul say, in that moment, Shaul sees something dramatic happen. He sees a no one. David was a no one at that point. I'll say he was a no one. And he sees a no one who rises out of obscurity and finds the courage to face the greatest enemy of the Jewish people. Shaul, Rabbi say, Goliath, put fear into the Jewish army each and every day. Shaul sees this young boy who, again, no one knew, was not a warrior, going out to go and do battle with Goliath. And he asks Avner, who is he descended from? Rabbi said, David HaMelech is from Shevet Yehuda. But Yehuda, remember, again, has twin boys. Zarach and Peretz. So Rabbi said, listen to this. So he asked Avner, which son of Yehuda is David descended from? So the Gemara says, Imi Peretz Asi. If he's descended from Peretz, Malkahavi. Ultimately, again, then this foreshadows that he will become king one day. Rabbi said the monarchical line. We often speak about that the monarchical line comes from Yehuda. It's true, but it comes from Yehuda through Peretz. So what Shaul is really asking in that moment is, which of the sons of Yehuda is David descended from? If he's from Peretz, then ultimately, again, that means he's going to be king. Shamelech poretz lasos derech ve'in b'machin biyado. Rabbi said this is very interesting, because why kings come from Peretz? Rabbi said, what does Peretz mean? What does Peretz mean? To make a breach. Because what does the king have a right to do? The king has a right to make breaches, and no one can stop. Rabbi said, eminent domain. The king could seize property for the purpose of the kingdom, right? The king could do things. He can make breaches, and no one could stop him. So the Gemara says, Imi Zerach Asi, or if he comes from Zerach, then Chashiva Ba'al Mahavi. Ultimately, again, he'll be important. He'll be very important, but he won't be king. So this is incredible. In this moment, when Shaul sees young, obscure, unknown David willing to summon up the courage and go out to battle with Goliath, says to Avner, who is this kid? Is he descendant from Zerach, or is he descendant from Peretz? Is he going to be a king, or is he just going to be someone chashuv? So the Gemara says, my taima. Rabbi said, listen to this. But what was it? In other words, what was it? See, what was it that sparked Shaul's curiosity? Also, we're going to see, by the way, it's more than curiosity. Shaul had fear. He had fear, right? He feared that this young man was going to eclipse him, which Rabbi says is what happened in the very next moment. So my time, let's listen to this. So my time, Amarle Shaul, why did Shaul feel compelled to ask about him? Listen to this. Dichsev vayilbas Shaul as David madav kimidasa. See, Rabbi say, here was the incredible part. Shaul allowed David to wear his armor. Then Rabbi said, now here's the incredible part. When Shaul became king, when Shmuel anointed him, the Navi described Shaul as being tall, broad, and very strapping, right? The strapping young man. The fact that David fit into his armor was a miracle. So both say Shaul and David were not the same size. David was younger and not the same size, right? Not the same build as Shaul. Yet, when David put on the armor of Shaul, it fit. So a young man put on the armor of the king, and it fit. When Kimidaso, Ksiv Bebe Shaul, Mishichvo Vamala Gava Mikalaam. Shaul will say ultimately again, and the Navi says about Shaul that he was a shoulder taller than everyone else. Shaul will say when Shaul sees this, he says, "Oh my gosh, my armor just fit perfectly, custom armor for this young man." That's number one, and number two, that's why it leads him to ask, "Who is he descended from? Shaul says, the Gemara goes, Shaul says, now watch this. Amalei Doeg, say just another minute. So Doeg Hadomin. Shaul say, Doeg was one of the advisors of Shaul. We're going to see Doeg Hadomi was a very, very, very bad man. He was a great Talmud Chacham, but he really did some terrible things, as we're going to see. So I'm like Doeg Hadomi. Wow. So Doeg tries to go ahead and immediately discredit David from the beginning. And he says to Shaul, Shaul, instead of asking where he's descended from on his father's side, why don't you go and figure out, is he from Zarach or from Peretz? I'll do you one better. Why don't you ask if he's Jewish, right? If he's even permitted lavo bakal, if he's even permitted to go and enter into the assembly of the Jewish people. My taima, deka'asim mirus hamoaviyah. So we'll say, watch this. Doeg goes ahead and says to Shaul, don't worry about this kid. Don't worry about this kid. He's not really even in a part of the normative Jewish people. Why not? Because he's a descendant of Rus. Rus was a Moabite convert. And Doeg says, as we know, the pasuk says, Lo yavo amoni umoavi bekal Hashem. So this David, he's a nice kid, but first of all, he still lives in the orbit of converts, and he'll never get out of that pool. Do you know why? Because he's descendant from Ammon and Moab. Avner pipes in. Amalei Avner Tanina. Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis. So we'll say Avner comes along and says, but one second, we've darshan from the pasuk that the prohibition to marry into the pool only applies to who? Male members of Ammon and Moab. So we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll say, but again, what I want to point out to you is, remember, how do we get into this? The Mishnah said that converts of Ammon and Moab, the men are always restricted to marrying within the marriage pool of the convert world. The women are immediately permitted to integrate. The Gemara is trying to figure out, where is this from? So the Gemara tells the whole story of David HaMelech, because of this response of Avner. Avner tries to Doeg tries to discredit David by saying he's not really even fully Jewish, and it's Ammoni Avala, right? Tries to discredit him. Then ultimately, again, Avner comes along and says, no, it only applies to the male members, not the female members. I will say, the drasha mir more of it, we're going to see tomorrow. Shkoyach.